Hi, I'm Mike, owner of the In-Groove in Phoenix, Arizona. We're a brick and mortar retail store, and today I'm going to go over with you the best sounding versions of Supertramp's Breakfast in America from 1978. This was kind of a hard record to go over just because it kind of was recorded a little bit weird. There's a lot of compression, there's a lot of distortion on the cymbals. You know, during Going Hollywood, some of the cymbals just sound like, I mean, they're being recorded from another room. It's really awful. So when you're looking for that, it kind of drives you a little bit crazy to even listen to this album over and over and over again. But, you know, I did my best and went through as many copies of this record as possible to kind of get you the best sounding version of this available. I'm going to kind of group these together. And the reason I'm going to do that is there's so many copies of this that are just awful that there's no sense in me telling you how everyone individually is awful. The first one I'm going to talk about is from 2008. This is the reissue that's been in print for probably the last 10 years. This is a god-awful sounding record. There's no bass, there's no dynamic range, and the thing I notice about this record is if you don't have a good sounding copy, the brass on the drum set is just drowned it out. It really took some masterful skill by a lot of these mastering engineers to get this record listenable. You're going to notice that, I mean, this is just awful, and without them tweaking that high end, it really, really suffers. Now these are the audiophile editions that were done in, I want to say the early 80s or the late 70s. They're all pressed on JVC super vinyl, same stuff that Mobile Fidelity used. Most of them are Canadian. You'll notice they have the kind of gold foil audiophile label. I don't know exactly what their definition of audiophile was at this point because these are pretty atrocious sounding as well. There's a little bit more bass than the new digital repress from 2008. But other than that, I mean, it's a really muddy, drowned out, I mean, really poor sounding record. Really muffled, really hard to listen to. These might even be digital. You know, the early audiophile records in the early 80s, they were digitizing stuff, cleaning it up in the digital domain, and then pressing it back to vinyl. Problem with that is you're going to get a lot of the early digital artifacts that they worked out a lot better with today's digital, but in the early days, they were really pretty awful. These might be that. I'm not 100% sure, but if not, they're pretty atrocious, and they're not very cheap either. I mean, most of these are in the $20 and $40 range. You'll see audiophile series stamped in gold. There's some that say half-speed mastered. All awful, all awful. Stay away from those. These are the first two Japanese pressings. Now these are quite a bit better. These are listenable. One of the problems the Japanese do, and I talk about this in a lot of my videos, is they have certain mastering choices that they do that are probably really desirable in the Japanese market. And one of those is they cut the bass. And the problem with doing that on this record is it kind of brings more attention to the high end, which, like I said, is quite distorted. And the record, side one, Going Hollywood, that's what you want to listen to. That's where you're going to notice it the most. It's not 100% sure what they were thinking when they recorded this record. Typically a band that put down really good sounding records. This one, unfortunately, is their most successful and suffers from it the worst. But they're listenable. Not something I'd seek out. If you had one and you really like the album, it's something I would replace and try to find a little better sounding copy. The next tier would be kind of your original US and UK pressings. These, the bass is a lot more prevalent as opposed to the Japanese, the digital, and the faux audiophile releases. You can kind of tell that this is how they wanted the album to sound. Although you still have that distortion, it's prevalent on the master tape. It's going to be on every single audiophile record, regular release, digital release, it doesn't matter, it's there. But these are quite good. Mild fan of the album, you could stick with one of these, no problem. You know, because after this, you're really going to have to spend some money to get an upgrade. So this is a pretty solid copy overall. You know, this album used to be a $2, $3 record 10 years ago, but now, you know, 10, 12, 13 bucks. It's weird. How they did this, I'm not 100% sure, but certain vocals are beautiful on this album. Guitar, wonderful. Keyboard, wonderful. It's just they had such issues recording the drum kit, and that's the big mistake with this album. In their recording, for whatever reason, they just had that drum set wired up to, I don't know if their equipment couldn't handle it at the time or whatever the case might be, but the drum set is the big drawback to the recording of this album. But these are quite good. UK pressing, US pressing. The UK pressing is pretty new for me. I got it about 2 months ago to film this video. Not something I'd pay the money for. The US pressing is every bit as good. And I find it a lot easier to find clean US pressings than I ever have clean UK pressings. I'm not 100% sure if the Brits are just trying to offload their crap on us and they're keeping all the nice clean records for themselves. But, you know, in the shop, I get this real clean and shrink pretty frequently. It was a big seller over here. I myself, out of these two, would probably seek out the UK pressing. Now, this is the original MFSL version of this that came out in the probably the 80s. Let's see if that's dated. Yeah, 1979 actually. So this is one of the early MFSL records. You know, MFSL in the 80s gets a bad rep because they kind of did what they called this, you know, people refer to as a smiley EQ, where they boosted the treble and they boosted the bass. I think in this case it actually helps because it kind of cleans up that distortion you're going to hear on these cymbals. Makes it a little bit more tolerable. Having the bass again, kind of, it's just one of the few early MFSL records that are actually really good sounding. One of my favorite of the early MFSL records, actually. Really good sounding. Is it worth the $100 you'll pay for it? It used to be. Used to be one of the top pressings you could get of this album. It's not anymore. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Well, the reason for that is the new MFSL pressing. Now, this came out at the end of the year. One thing you're going to notice about this is the bass. I don't know if they boosted it for this particular record or that's what's on the master tape, but it is prevalent. More prevalent than any other pressing of this album out there. You're going to hear some people complain that the distortion on the drums are more noticeable with this particular version. And I think that's just because it is a very clear sounding record. You're going to get a lot of separation in the sound stage. And because of that, I think it's more noticeable. You're going to actually hear the defect on the master tape, which is the drum distortion. I don't think on this it was anything that MFSL did. I just think that's when you make this album in a really clean, presentable way, nice master tape transfer, for instance, it's going to be more prevalent. Some people might find the bass a little bit too annoying on this, but if you got a system that can handle it, this is the way to go. For $35, which is the MSRP on this record currently, this is your overall bang for the buck. It's going to be trouncing on all the other pressings by a huge margin. Extremely clean, quiet vinyl, pressed at RTI. Nice, clean mastering. You know, really a solid. I was really looking forward to this record. I'm glad they didn't do it on 45 RPM. For the price, You can't beat this record. This is an exceptional value for 35 bucks compared to what else is out there on the market, especially when you consider it's a third of the price of the original MFSL, and it doesn't sound, the original MFSL doesn't sound nearly as good. And this is the record that I think is the best sounding version of this album, period. This is the Nimbus Supercut. Nimbus did special order through a hi-fi magazine in the UK to where you could order the records directly from them. They never gave official release numbers on these. They did somewhere between 500 and 1,500 of these, depending on what title they did. They didn't do a ton of titles. This, though, is exceptional sounding. The bass is just dialed back a little bit from what you're going to hear on the new 2017 MFSL, but I think just the overall presentation is more like the original US or UK pressing, but much cleaner, much better sound stage. Whatever they did, I think, in my opinion, this is a record that they just did the best job addressing the distortion, the cymbal distortion on the album. It's just the way this album flows, it's not as noticeable. It's a much more organic flow. But you're going to pay, and I've had this quite a while, and I think 5-6 years ago I paid 200 bucks for this album. So it's not really cheap, not easily found. Like I said, maybe 500 to 1,500 of them they did. So you're going to have a difficult time finding it. I waited, I think I got this around 2012, 2013 maybe, and I want to say I waited around 8 or 9 months for one of these to pop up on eBay. Didn't really use Discogs too much back then, but waiting this out on eBay was a while. You really got to like this album to pay 200 bucks for this, because the new 2017 MFSL is not far behind it. I think about 98% of the people out there, the MFSL is the way to go. If it's one of your top albums, you really want it to be the best, you can get it. You got money to burn, one stumbles in your lap, this is really the way to go. It's just a smidge, like I said, a smidge better than that MFSL. Again, a more organic sound. 2,000 to about 200 bucks. I should have checked the prices on this, because you might end up paying more now. Might be $200-300 now. Prices of vinyl are, they're going up. Your high-end vinyl isn't creeping up like the lower-end stuff. Like I said, the original US pressing of this was a couple $2 record. Now 10, 15 bucks for a real clean copy. But stuff like this hasn't been as affected, as much. Otherwise, this would be a $2,000 album, and it's not. So again, my choice is, if you were going to have one fall in your lap, money was no object, or you love this album and you want it to be the best it could possibly sound, the Nimbus Supercut. Really, I think the overall best choice, not far behind the Nimbus Supercut, is the 2017 MFSL. And for 3 times the money and a much, much distant third, which makes this, pretty much not worthless, but for a listener to go out and buy this, getting a top quality sound, this is not what it was even but a couple years ago. When this wasn't in the picture anymore, this was practical, it was easy to find. This was my go-to copy before I got the Nimbus. I listened to this, I rocked this MFSL version for years. And it was, like I said, it was one of the few that I actually didn't mind playing. The Smiley EQ was beneficial on this record. Then I got the the Nimbus Supercut, that was better. And this, 35 bucks, you can't go wrong with this. All right, that's it, guys. Don't forget to subscribe. If you want to be the first one to get these videos, you got to subscribe. If you have any questions, or if there's any videos you want to see me do in the future, this Supertramp was a recommended video, not something I was going to do. But if there's a recommendation, go ahead and put it in the comments, and I'll try to get to those. All right, guys, and until next time,